Welcome to the Revenue Cycle Rundown with Keybridge Medical Revenue Care. Our live show features respected industry experts that will take us on a deeper dive into today's hottest rev cycle topics. We're glad you're here for the rundown. Let's get started.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Revenue Cycle Rundown. Your host here, Brian Garver, and I'm pleased to introduce, most of you know this gentleman, but we're excited to have him on our show today, David Kelly from Rutan. David, tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, and what you're up to these days.
Sure. As we were talking about right before we launched, Ohio, not born, but certainly raised, essentially my whole life here in Western Ohio, and glad to hail from the area. And I am on my second stint at my current employer. So they're, good enough to return to, which is always a nice thing to say, right? So Rutan Health is an independent sole community hospital, rural hospital in West Central Ohio. And we're trying to stay that way. A lot of independent hospitals are struggling, and we are no different. But my current role gives me a couple different lenses and a couple hats to wear, running both the revenue cycle and then the operations of our medical group. I get to oversee both of those, which is a lot of fun. It's challenging to change gears sometimes between the two of those, but just trying to keep us out there and independent and doing great work for the local community.
Yeah, glad to hear that. David, it's no secret to our viewers. They've seen you, they've heard of you. Many of them have maybe worked with you or attended one of your speaking events. You've kind of been on the speaking network with HFMA and other organizations. What are some of the topics that have bubbled to the top with some of these events you've been invited to speak at of late?
Well, I'm happy to speak to that, but I'm going to do it in a biased way because I'm going to reference something that I chose to speak about at Central Ohio Patient Account Managers earlier this year, which is a great local organization here in Ohio, which is I was trying to sort of the call to action about how violence towards healthcare workers or the normalization of some of this is out there in society, and it's increasingly prevalent. And we see after the UHC CEO shooting and Mr. Mangione's alleged actions, he's not convicted, so alleged actions, but there's a lot of fallout from that where people are essentially condoning this and not limiting it to even healthcare executive, health insurance executives. So I just want people to be aware, like, you got to have an eye out on security for your team, but you also have to have an eye out on people in society got here for a reason. So that's something I'm feeling particularly interested in, is like, how do we do right for our team and right by our patients? But there's other things out there in the ether. I think there's a lot of buzz, but also growing cynicism about AI, right? Because everybody's talking about it, and it's like, okay, what's real and what's not, and how much is hype? And then the other thing is just affordability, and the affordability of healthcare is in the United States is not at a good point, and it hasn't been for a while. And what can we do about it? Because what can we do about it is particularly challenging. My understanding from Ohio Hospital Association is the average operating margin for hospitals in the state of Ohio is negative last year. Okay, well, if we want to be more affordable, how do we achieve that without then closing our own doors, right?
Yeah.
And shooting ourselves in the foot.
Hospitals already operating in the red, and when they're in the black, it's a razor thin margin. Mm-hmm. They're already shorthanded. They've cut staff to bare minimums to keep their head above water. So how do you do that?
Right.
And your expertise in revenue cycle is really one of the keys to success. How are you and how is our industry being more effective uncovering new sources of additional revenue? How can we manage and control costs of collecting that revenue? It's been a real uphill battle. And I like what you said early on, though, David, about even at Rutan. I mean, rural health in America, it is a mountain to climb. Mm-hmm. And, I've personally been involved in some of the rural health associations throughout the Midwest, been to some of their events, and have had the privilege of speaking at their events. And I hear from people like you that are at those rural hospitals, trying to stay independent. Some are succeeding, some are failing. What's working for you at Mary Rutan? How are you folks continuing to stay the course, stay independent? How are you finding, the path forward there?
Difficult or challengingly. We've had off again, on again over the last couple of years of being, as you called it, a razor thin in the black operating margin, and in the red, in line with industry averages. And so it's a matter of continuing to try to make sure that we are retaining talent. I mean, nothing I'm going to say is revolutionary. Retaining and attracting talent, and that includes physicians, and that most particularly includes physicians who want to be practicing in a rural environment, who are not just sort of swooping in, but trying to bring maybe a big hospital model to town, because things operate differently in rural.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literally conversations we have on recruiting calls with docs, is like, well, talk to us about that, and your either passion for that or your tolerance for that, that different way of operating, and some of those types of things. But ultimately, some of our biggest successes have been, under our CEO's leadership in this last year, to make sure that places like our ER, which is really the front door, like, how do we strive for excellence, not just in care outcomes, but in service outcomes there? Because I think that most people who've lived in maybe a county that only has one hospital out there has lived an experience where the community might feel like, oh, our hospital's just a Band-Aid station, or our hospital does a bad job. But because there's only one in the county, patients of necessity, I guess you could say, come back and therefore have long memories. So we'll routinely hear about, this thing happened to my uncle. It's like, when was that? Well, it was in 1987. It's like, okay, that's probably not relevant anymore. Probably, one hopes. And so we have to invest in those experiences through our front door, because if patient has one bad experience, it can live for literally decades. And so we've got some really key goals on that our organization is doing great on. But again, none of it's rocket science. It's blocking and tackling of the basics of healthcare operations. And that's a phrase we actually use routinely internally, is like, how do we improve the blocking and tackling?
I love it.
And just staying focused.
Something we talk a lot about is what you're alluding to. I mean, a couple of Ohio guys here, but a famous Ohio guy, Woody Hayes, once said profoundly, you win with people. Mm-hmm. And he was right. And it's the truth today. And what you said earlier really is resonating with me. When I've seen rural hospitals struggle and continue to struggle, and then finally just, give up and give out to that system that wants to come in and buy them or acquire them, or just close their doors. Mm-hmm. It typically starts with the erosion of the people, the docs, the mm-hmm. providers, the specialty providers. When that starts to erode and there's no replacement, now your top line revenue starts eroding, and your value to the community starts eroding. And the community knows that, and they immediately just start thinking of somewhere else as their first choice of healthcare even. So I agree. I think it really begins and ends with your people. And I love what you said about the focus on recruiting the right type of docs that want to be part of that rural community and serve in that rural community in a rural setting, rural hospital. And it's a lifestyle too. I think, that's the other thing. A doc wants, and their family has to want to be part of that community, be part of that lifestyle.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing sort of implied in what you talked about with the erosion of rural hospitals, in many cases, if you lose your providers, is then it also erodes the community's trust, because are they going to be able to have this service next week or next month or whatever? And we want to be able to be trusted, and trust is not at an all-time high in hospitals and in physicians. Physicians do better than hospitals do, like culturally, in terms of trust. But so a lot of that is tied with that service and outcomes, is trying to rebuild that in our community. I think others are as well, while also making sure that we have trust, our team trusts our leadership, that we trust our team to do a good job. Trust is like a currency, and you got to make a lot of deposits for every single withdrawal, because the withdrawals, they hurt you,
they hurt bad.
And they hurt bad.
They hurt bad, and they happen quick. And it's the old
Mhm.
saying, I don't remember exactly what it is, but it can take years to build trust in a moment, a split moment, to lose it. And once you've lost it, it's gone. And it takes, a long time to earn that back. And today with, social media, people posting an experience that they didn't feel was a quality one, and it gets shared 10,000 times, and it gets maybe even exaggerated at times on social media. That happens.
Never.
It's challenging in today's, world of social media with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have I think a lot of hospitals do, but so we're no different maybe, but we have a dedicated team, not just who is, keeping an eye on stuff on social media, but also, customer complaint hotline, because we want to hear about that. We want to catalog it. We want to respond to it. We want to make changes to processes. Is everybody always get their way when they file a complaint? No, but you're heard, and we take that back and we talk about it, and we have, work is done to try to do better when we particularly if we see a pattern, and things like that. And I guess I sort of assume that every hospital has that. Maybe they don't, but we're proud of it because it's definitely yielded some good results over the years. And Brian, I think that also goes to something that we had talked about ahead of today's call, was just trying to bring some of the empathy to the patient, which goes back to like, how do we make sure if healthcare is unaffordable, which we've talked about here on the air, and if there is this culture of low trust in hospitals, and if there is this tolerance for violence, like how do we solve it? I think one of the things that we solve it is empathy for where our patients are. When they interact with us, they're probably on one of their worst days, if it's not an elective service, and then they're going to incur a bill. And they may not have chosen their plan. Maybe their employer chose it, or maybe whatever, but they've got a bill.
Or it's what they could afford.
It's what they could afford, right? They're on a bronze plan or something like that with the exchange.
High deductible.
Yeah, high deductible. And I'm 15 years ago, maybe those plans wouldn't have existed and they wouldn't have had any insurance. But okay, so we could debate that all day long. But point is, they've got this bill that they didn't necessarily ask for. And we rendered services, so we're feeling like we need made whole. But how do we bring at least the empathy to where the patient is? And I'm not going to pretend to have any answers on that. That's sort of a journey for us. But one of the things that our CEO has challenged myself and my rev cycle operators with this year is just do better by our patients in terms of charity, in terms of payment plan options. Not that we're doing a bad job, but like, he can read the tea leaves. Like, we need to do better. And so we are looking at in depth all of our policies. We're looking at, doing more with presumptive charity. We're looking at doing more with that. We have, we've got an outside vendor that we use for, following up on patient bills. And we're trying to have that be part of the conversation with them, is like, how are we approaching people? We don't want to be push, push, push. We want to be, how do we create a solution? And I think that's part of what you guys try to do, from what I understand. And I think that's what we have to do, because the way of like wagging your finger at people and like pay your bill, I just don't think people are having it anymore. So
no, it doesn't work. I mean, the data proves it doesn't work. And the organizations that are shifting to your mindset and culture are having more success than the ones that are just stubborn and want to just pound that. Well, we're going to send you 3 statements and a final notice, and you better pay or else. Society today, they demand a little more respect,
right,
and a little bit more empathy, like you said. It's tricky when something healthcare wise happens in your family. You didn't choose that. You didn't plan on that. It's not like going out and overextending yourself purposefully on a car you can't afford.
Right.
No, it happened. Now, how can your organization, David, and our organization at Keybridge, how can we assist? How can we help that patient navigate with care and empathy and understanding and come up with a solution that works for everybody?
Right.
I love that you guys are focused on that. You and I talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, and we chatted about a video that was done by the Cleveland Clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one about, I can't remember the title of it, but it's about walking a mile in a patient's shoes, putting yourself in their shoes as we begin to engage with that patient. And when we do that, and we're really understanding where they're coming from and what they've been through, I mean, would we maybe treat them differently? Probably.
Right.
So I love that you guys are focused on that. Let me switch gears for a second, David, because I know the audience is always curious about this. You've had a stellar career. I mean, if people find you on LinkedIn, they'll see your experience. It's been outstanding. When did it all start? When did you make a decision? You know what? I'm gonna go into healthcare, into the revenue cycle world, and make a difference. When did that happen? How did that happen? Inquiring minds want to know.
Goodness gracious. Well, I've tried to live with some core values in my career around transparency, and so sometimes you hate to put your motivations out to the world, but I will. I've had an unconventional path. I remember talking to Ed Marks one time about his unconventional path. He's like an architect or interior designer by education, right? And so I went to undergraduate school at Dave Letterman's alma mater, Ball State, for the same thing, video and film and TV production. I thought I was going to go make movies, and I learned that that was probably not the right field for me. And then took some time in between that and grad school and got into medical equipment sales. Just kind of being extroverted, I guess that it was a good fit. And I was sitting with the other salesmen one day looking at the Dayton Business Journal's book of lists, and they had all these high compensated folks in local healthcare. And I was like, okay, well, I'd seen my dad get sort of his jobs outsourced to India and things like that. And I was like, what can be not easily outsourced and makes a good living? And I'm looking at this book of lists, and I'm like, well, healthcare leadership sounds like a good job, can't easily be outsourced, make a good living. And ended up going to grad school and on down that road. But it was never like I sought out rev cycle. The main thing that I've always sought out, and I got this, I think, from listening to Mike Rowe or something like that, which was sort of this idea that like pursue your passion is a bit of malarkey. That's my word, not his. But it's almost like become passionate about what you're doing, and then you will have success. Like find a way to be passionate about what you're doing. So if I'm doing rev cycle, I'm going to be passionate about that. If I'm trying to operate the medical group like I do today, I'm going to be passionate about that. If you pick me up and drop me into making a movie, I'm going to be passionate about that. Whatever it is, I'm going to find something where, like, if we're doing a job, there's a reason to do it. Let's get passionate about that rather than pursue your passion. And so I guess you could say I almost manufactured that passion for rev cycle and for healthcare, but it's true. I live it and I believe it. It's not fake. I really believe in what providers do for their communities, both physicians and hospitals. And I just want to do better, every day. And so if my team, I don't do all the hairy legwork. All my team does that now. I'm blessed to be at that stage of my career. And they do wonderful work. So if I can just help them do a little bit better every day and bring sort of my graduate degree alma mater, Xavier Jesuit education inspired servant leadership, do a little bit better every day, I get to go home happy. And that's sort of living the passion that I found in this career path. So that was a long-winded answer. Forgive me for that.
No, I love it. It's not what you do, it's just who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as I go about and speak to other healthcare revenue cycle experts, in the provider world, they're always challenged, they're pulling their hair out. Like, how do we raise the bar? How do we get better? How do we elevate? How do we perform, better? And it comes down to what you talked about, leadership. It comes down to culture. It comes down to being passionate. That word is so powerful and it gets used a lot, but being passionate about what you're doing and building a team that's passionate about what you're doing.
Yeah.
And by the way, before we wrap up, I'm curious, how do you do that? How have you found success as a leader building a culture of passion, building a culture of empathy and care for the patient? How do you instill that? I think that's a big challenge out there in healthcare. We all want it, but how do we do it?
For myself, speaking only for myself, I just try to tie what my team would say, I routinely say is tying to like, how do we tie to the mission and how do we, and the sort of implied mission of staying independent. When I wasn't at an independent hospital and I was at a larger organization, I might try to more often be, if I was sort of in a corporate role, try to be that voice of the patient. What's the patient's role, right? Because those corporate roles sometimes are more separated from the care. I'm pretty close. I'm only a few degrees separated from the care here. Yeah. So I don't look at that as my role as much. My role is more about the long-term sustainability and helping the team make sure they're keeping an eye on that. At the corporate, it might be more about the patient. So like finding a way to keep your team members having a mental eye on the prize has worked well for me. Again, not secret sauce. Nothing I have today.
But a shared vision.
Sauce, but it's shared vision. It's the cliche. What do you want to call it? Rowing together. It's whatever. Yeah. But it's literally saying it, because I think that we assume that people are bought in on these things, or we assume that our coworkers believe in the same things. But if you don't actually voice the words into the ether, they're not necessarily real, and you can't live on the assumption that the other people have that. You got to say it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's something that I'm super passionate too. You talked about being a servant leader. You talked about empathy. Now you're talking about having a shared vision and everybody rowing together and saying it out loud so that everybody's crystal clear. It's not assumed. Everybody's crystal clear about what's the mountain we're climbing. And we all climbing together in the same direction. And when that happens, that solves a lot of problems. And in my exploration across the Midwest and healthcare facilities, I often see misguided vision, not misguided, unaligned. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Unaligned vision. You could ask one person from the department, hey, what's the real vision of this department? What do you stand for? What's your anthem? And they'll say, oh, it's this, Brian, it's this. And then you ask somebody else in the same department, they're like, oh, it's this over here. And somebody else might say, oh, it's over here. Well, no wonder there's tug of war. No wonder there's, just angst and anxiety and stress and chaos. What you said, really gets people to the top of the mountain the quickest. I agree with that 100%. One last question.
Sure.
What do you see next in our industry? Where do you see the revenue cycle industry going to advance ourselves? I mean, there's we're in a world of data analytics and microdata. We're in a world now of automation, and people talk about AI. But I also hear you talking about the human factor.
Mm-hmm.
Are we moving away from that? Do we need to come back, or what are your thoughts? What's next? Where do we go as a healthcare business sector in America?
So that's a very big question for the tail end of this conversation. So I will try to not be long-winded about my thoughts on it.
You're fine.
I think that there's a couple things. Like when I talk to folks who are maybe a little bit more seasoned in their career than I am, and our rev cycle people, they're sort of like, hey, nothing anybody's talking about today is new. It's the same stuff we were talking about 20 years ago, just maybe on a faster speed of cycle of like, how do we get clean claims out faster? How do we get, like, a lot of those problems or deal with denials are the same as 20 years ago. And so that makes me somewhat frustrated, because it's, admittedly, I go to a conference and I hear the same thing about point of service or this, that, or the other. as I heard 10 years ago. And so are we really even innovating, right? I mean, we're innovating in like tiny micro sections, but are we truly innovating? But ultimately,
we're just repeating the same mistakes and challenges over and over without, like you said, innovating and moving forward. Yeah,
exactly. Now, admittedly, some of that is because the way we get paid is the same as it was 10 or 20 years ago. And so there's lots and lots of talk about value-based care. I am a capital V value-based cynic, just because I think a lot of it is mostly risk shifting. And I don't know, I mean, how much it's truly moving the needle on patients' health. When we look at population health stats, a lot of them don't seem to be there, but I'm a big believer in what I call lowercase v value. Like, patients don't want to go in, get treated, and have a bad outcome. So we have to do better there. So as reimbursement models move, obviously that's going to be a thing. There's lots and lots of talk. Ben Regal has some very good thoughts about direct to employer. And I think that changes how RevCycle works. And I think in some ways it moves RevCycle responsibilities to the employer away from the hospital. Like the employer needs to understand how claims work and how and how to manage their, even if it's not fully direct to employer, but it's their ERISA plan. Employers want to get their hands around costs. Stop calling a broker. You could talk to some RevCycle people, I think, or some managed care people, and probably figure out how to stop wasting money on your medical, spend. So that's something that's coming. And then ultimately, the raw demographics in this country indicate that there's just not enough talent in the next generation for most jobs. That includes RevCycle jobs. And so, no, I do not think that while I want my people to be vested in our organization, I want my organization to be vested in my people, and for them to if not enjoy coming to work, to at least not hate coming to work. But there's just not enough of them. So whether that's offshore, whether that's AI, whether that's some other new innovative solution that I haven't thought up, I don't think that the ship is changing course on that one just because of raw demographics.
Right. I follow you. Well, David, thank you for letting us pick your brain, get inside your world a little bit today, and just get to know you better. Folks, if you're out there and you want to find out more about David, check him out on LinkedIn. He's got a great profile and plenty of information there. And I'm sure you'll see him at upcoming events in the HFMA and industry world as well. David, thanks again for being our guest. I want you to have a great day. And everybody, thanks for joining us. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye now.